On Christmas Day, 1944, the deadliest North American P-51 Mustang pilot in history died under American guns while chasing an enemy fighter across snow-covered Belgium. He had survived hundreds of combat missions, 6 kills in a single afternoon, and a mid-air collision that should have killed him. But on that frozen morning, friendly fire ended what the Luftwaffe could not. Before we tell you how the war's most lethal Mustang ace met his end, subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and comment below with your city, state, or country so we know where you are watching from. This is the story of Major George Preddy, and it does not end the way heroes are supposed to. George Earl Preddy Jr. was born in Greensboro, North Carolina, on February 12, 1919, into a world still reeling from the First War that had consumed Europe. His father was a Baptist minister who believed in discipline, duty, and the moral architecture of service. George grew up lean and restless, the kind of boy who needed speed and height and the sensation of controlling something powerful. By the time he reached manhood, aviation had ceased to be a novelty and had become a profession, a calling for young men who wanted something more than the predictable trajectories of factory floors and family businesses. George wanted the sky. He applied to the United States Navy with the confidence of someone who had never been told no by anything that mattered. The Navy told him no. They found something in his physical examination, some minor defect or irregularity that disqualified him from the flight program. The specifics were bureaucratic and cold. He applied again. They rejected him again, and then again. Each rejection was a door slammed in his face, each one reinforcing the message that his body, through no fault of his own, was inadequate for the thing he wanted most. Some men would have accepted this and moved on. George Preddy was not some men. He turned to the United States Army Air Forces. They had different standards, different needs, and different bureaucracies. They looked at the same body the Navy had deemed unfit and saw potential. In 1941, he entered flight training. The world was collapsing into war, and the Army needed pilots faster than it could produce them. George proved himself capable in every metric that mattered. He could fly. He could navigate. He could shoot. By the time the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, he was already deep into a training pipeline that would carry him toward combat whether he was ready or not. His first operational assignment sent him to the Pacific Theater with the 49th Fighter Group, flying Curtiss P-40 Warhawks in Australia and New Guinea. The P-40 was not a graceful aircraft. It was heavy, underpowered at altitude, and obsolete before the war even began. But it could dive, and it could absorb punishment, and if you flew it correctly, it could kill. George flew it correctly. He learned how to manage energy, how to use gravity and speed to offset the limitations of his machine, how to anticipate an enemy's turn before the enemy made it. But he did not kill. Mission after mission, he encountered Japanese aircraft and either missed his opportunities or found himself outmaneuvered by pilots flying Mitsubishi Zeros that could turn inside anything the Americans had. Frustration became a constant companion. He was good enough to survive but not good enough to win, and that gap tormented him. Then on a mission over New Guinea, another American fighter collided with him in midair. Metal screamed. The world spun. His aircraft disintegrated around him, control surfaces ripping away, the engine shrieking as fragments of another plane tore through his fuselage and wings. He should have died in that moment. Physics and probability both demanded it. Instead, he rode the wreckage down through thin air, fought the stick, and somehow brought what remained of the P-40 back to something resembling controlled flight. He landed hard. The airframe was a total loss. George climbed out with cuts, bruises, and the kind of shaking that comes after your body realizes it is still alive when it should not be. The collision broke something inside him that was not physical. He spent weeks recovering, and during that time he replayed every decision, every angle, every split second of the missions he had flown. He was alive because of luck, and luck was not a strategy. When he returned to flight status, he was different, calmer, more precise. He understood now that survival and aggression were not opposites but partners, that hesitation killed you just as surely as recklessness. But the Pacific was a grinding, attritional theater where opportunities were rare, and the enemy was learning faster than the Americans were. George wanted something more. In late 1943, he transferred to the European theater and joined the 8th Air Force, stationed in England with the 352nd Fighter Group. The mission profile was different here. Instead of low-altitude intercepts over jungles, he would be escorting heavy bombers deep into Germany, flying at 25,000 feet in formations that stretched for miles. The aircraft was different too. He was assigned to fly the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a machine so large and heavy that pilots called it the Jug. It had 850 caliber machine guns, a supercharged engine that performed beautifully at high altitude, and the glide characteristics of a falling anvil. George hated it. The Thunderbolt could not turn with German fighters. It could dive, and it could climb, and it could absorb terrifying amounts of battle damage, but in a knife fight at medium altitude it was a liability. George flew it competently, but competence was not enough. He scored a handful of kills, but each one felt like a struggle against the limitations of his own equipment. He watched Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190 as slice through formations, make their attacks, and escape before the Thunderbolts could bring their weight to bear. The bomber crews were dying, and the fighters were supposed to stop it, but the math was not working. Then, in early 1944, the 352nd Fighter Group transitioned to the North American P-51 Mustang, and everything changed. The Mustang was not the most powerful fighter in the sky. It was not the fastest in a dive or the best climbing, but it was balanced. It had range that no other single-engine fighter could match, which meant it could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It had speed and maneuverability at every altitude. It had 650 caliber machine guns, and the kind of handling that made it feel like an extension of the pilot's nervous system. George Preddy climbed into a Mustang and understood immediately that he had been given the weapon he needed. His kill count began to climb. 1, 2, 5, 10. He was methodical, patient, and utterly without mercy once he committed to an attack. He understood deflection shooting better than most pilots ever would, the geometry of leading a target so that bullets and aircraft arrived at the same point in space at the same instant. He understood energy management, how to trade altitude for speed and speed for position, how to force an enemy into a situation where every option led to death. He flew with his wingman, Captain William Wisner, a pilot almost as deadly as he was, and together they became a killing team that German pilots learned to avoid. August 6, 1944 began like any other mission. George woke before dawn in a cold Quonset hut on an airfield in eastern England. He had flown the day before and the day before that. He was tired in the way that accumulates over months, a fatigue that sleep does not fully cure. But the mission board was posted and his name was on it, and there was no room for negotiation. The target was Hamburg. The bomber stream would be massive, hundreds of Boeing B-17 flying fortresses grinding their way across the North Sea and into Germany. The Mustangs would shepherd them in, hold station during the bomb run, and escort them out. It was supposed to be routine. George attended the briefing in a room thick with cigarette smoke and the low murmur of pilots comparing notes and checking maps. The intelligence officer laid out the route, the expected flak concentrations, the known Luftwaffe bases along the flight path. The weather was good. Visibility would be excellent. The Luftwaffe had been battered in recent months, their pilot training programs were collapsing, and fuel shortages were limiting their operational capacity. But they were not dead, and they were not harmless, and they still had enough experienced pilots to make any mission dangerous. George walked to his aircraft in the pre-dawn gray. His crew chief had the Mustang ready, engine cowling panels secured, guns loaded, fuel tanks topped off. The name painted on the fuselage was "Cripes a Mighty," a phrase that meant nothing and everything, the kind of joke that pilots used to deflect the weight of what they were about to do. He climbed into the cockpit, settled into the seat, and began the startup checklist. Engine start. Instruments check. Radio check. Canopy locked. He taxied into position, waited for the signal, and then pushed the throttle forward and felt the Mustang surge down the runway and lift into the air. The formation assembled over England, dozens of Mustangs slotting into position around the bomber stream. George took his place in the flight, scanning the sky with the automatic vigilance of someone who had learned that the first sign of the enemy was usually the last thing you saw. The North Sea passed below, gray and featureless. The Dutch coast appeared, then disappeared. They crossed into German airspace, and the flak began, black puffs of 88mm shells detonating at altitude, each one a gamble that could shred an aircraft in an instant. The bombers held formation. The fighters weaved above them, watching. The call came over the radio. Bandits, multiple contacts, high and diving. George scanned the sky and saw them, a formation of German fighters angling down toward the bomber stream from the northwest. Messerschmitt 109 Gustavs, the latest variant, fast and deadly in the hands of someone who knew how to fly them. George broke formation and climbed to meet them, Whistler tight on his wing. The geometry of the engagement unfolded in seconds. The Germans had altitude and speed. George had position and patience. He waited until the range closed, then fired a short burst that missed. The lead Gustav broke left. George followed, pulling lead, compensating for deflection, and fired again. Strikes. Pieces of the Gustav's wing tore away. The German pilot rolled inverted and dove, streaming smoke. George did not follow. The sky was full of aircraft, and tunnel vision killed. He pulled up, scanned, and found another target. A lone Focke-Wulf 190A, separated from its formation, trying to climb back to safety. George dove on it, building speed, closing the distance before the German pilot even knew he was there. He fired from 400 yards, walked the tracers into the fuselage, and watched the 190A shudder and roll onto its back. The pilot belayed out. George did not watch him fall. He was already looking for the next target. The next one was another 109, this one trying to make a slashing attack on a straggling bomber. George intercepted from above, dove past the Gustav, then pulled up in a climbing turn that bled off speed but gave him position. The German pilot saw him and broke hard right, trying to force an overshoot. George anticipated it, rolled inverted, pulled through, and came out directly behind the Gustav with perfect deflection. He fired. The Gustav's canopy exploded. The aircraft nosed over and went down, trailing fire. He found a fourth target almost immediately, another 190A trying to escape to the east. This one was flown by someone competent, someone who knew how to use the 190A's roll rate and dive speed to stay alive. George chased him down through 15,000 feet, matching every maneuver, waiting for the mistake. It came when the German pilot tried to reverse into him, a gamble that would have worked against a less skilled opponent. George rolled with him, pulled inside his turn, and fired from less than 200 yards. The 190A came apart, pieces of cowling and wing tumbling through the air. The fifth kill was a 109 that made the mistake of trying to climb away. George had energy and altitude, and he used both, closing from behind and above, firing a long burst that tore through the engine and cockpit. The Gustav rolled slowly to the left and began a flat spin that would end in a field somewhere below. The sixth kill happened almost by accident. George was climbing back toward the bomber stream when he saw a lone Messerschmitt 110, a twin-engine heavy fighter that had been designed to destroy bombers and was helpless against a Mustang. The German crew saw him coming and tried to run, pushing their engines to maximum power and diving for the deck. George followed, patient and relentless, closing the distance meter by meter. He fired from dead astern, and the 110's left engine exploded. The aircraft rolled, stalled, and went in. George pulled up, chest heaving, hands shaking on the stick. His fuel was low. His ammunition was nearly gone. The bomber stream was already turning for home. He rejoined the formation, checked in with his wingman, and began the long flight back to England. He did not feel triumphant. He felt empty, drained, and vaguely sick. 6 aircraft in one afternoon. 6 pilots dead or captured. He had done his job, and his job was killing, and there was no glory in it, only necessity. When he landed, the ground crew counted the gun camera footage and confirmed all 6 kills. The intelligence officers verified the claims against bomber crew reports and radio intercepts. 6 confirmed victories in a single mission. No other Mustang pilot had done it. No other Mustang pilot ever would. George Preddy had just written his name into the record books in a way that would never be erased. But the war did not stop for records. Within days, he was flying again, escorting bombers, hunting fighters, grinding through mission after mission in a campaign that seemed to have no end. His total climbed. 15 kills, 20, 25. He became the highest-scoring Mustang pilot in the 8th Air Force and then the highest-scoring Mustang pilot in the entire war. The numbers were abstract. What mattered was that he was still alive, still flying, still killing, and the Luftwaffe was still in the sky. In the autumn of 1944, the Army sent him home on a war bond tour. He was supposed to sell bonds, give speeches, shake hands, and smile for cameras. He hated every moment of it. The crowds wanted a hero, someone who could stand on a stage and tell them that the war was noble and the enemy was evil and victory was certain. George could not give them that. He could tell them how to shoot a deflection shot. He could tell them how a Mustang handled at 300 miles per hour in a diving turn. He could tell them what it felt like to watch a man bail out of a burning aircraft. But he could not tell them that any of it meant something larger than survival. The tour dragged on for weeks, and when it finally ended, he requested an immediate return to combat. He returned to England in late 1944 and found that the war had changed again. The Luftwaffe was collapsing, but it was also concentrating its remaining strength in desperate, all-or-nothing attacks. Jet aircraft were appearing in the skies, Messerschmitt 262s that could outrun anything the Allies had. The ground war was grinding toward Germany, and the bombers were hitting targets deeper and deeper into enemy territory. George resumed flying, but now he also assumed command of the 328th Fighter Squadron, a unit that had been underperforming and needed someone who could lead by example. He transformed the squadron in a matter of weeks. He flew every mission. He debriefed every pilot. He corrected mistakes, rewarded aggression, and built a culture where mediocrity was unacceptable. The squadron's kill count began to climb. Morale improved. The 328th became the most effective fighter squadron in the 8th Air Force, and George Preddy was the reason why. He did not lead from behind a desk. He led from the cockpit, and his pilots followed him because they knew he would not ask them to do anything he would not do himself. By December, his confirmed total stood at 26.83 aerial victories, a number that included shared kills and ground strafing credits. He was the top Mustang ace, and he was still flying, still hunting, still alive in a war that had killed most of the men who had started it with him. And then the weather turned, and the Germans launched their final offensive in the west, and everything fell apart. The Battle of the Bulge began on December 16, 1944, when German armored divisions smashed through American lines in the Ardennes forest. The weather was atrocious, thick clouds and fog that grounded most Allied aircraft and gave the Germans the cover they needed to advance. For days, the ground forces fought without air support, and the German columns pushed deeper into Belgium. Then, on Christmas Eve, the weather broke. The skies cleared. The Allied air forces launched everything they had, and the German offensive began to collapse under the weight of coordinated air attacks. George flew multiple missions on Christmas Eve, strafing convoys, attacking supply lines, and hunting for any Luftwaffe fighters foolish enough to challenge Allied air superiority. He was exhausted. The entire squadron was exhausted. They had been flying nonstop for days, operating in freezing conditions, landing and refueling and taking off again without rest. But the mission board kept posting new targets, and the war kept demanding more. On Christmas morning, 1944, George woke to another mission. The target was enemy armor and transport near Liege, Belgium. The weather was clear and cold, perfect flying conditions. He attended the briefing, walked to his aircraft, and took off with his flight into a sky filled with Allied aircraft. The 9th Air Force was running ground attack missions. The 8th Air Force was running bomber escort. The Royal Air Force was hitting targets across the front. The sky over Belgium was the most congested airspace in the history of warfare. Thousands of aircraft operating simultaneously in a narrow corridor, and every anti-aircraft gunner on the ground was firing at anything that moved. George's flight arrived over the target area and began searching for enemy aircraft. The radio was chaos, dozens of voices calling out contacts, confirming targets, coordinating attacks. Flak bursts filled the sky, black and gray puffs that marked every altitude band. And then someone spotted a pair of German fighters, Focke-Wulf 190DS, low and fast, trying to escape to the east. George rolled into a dive and went after them, his wingman following. The Germans were good. They stayed low, using terrain to mask their approach, jinking and weaving to spoil his aim. George closed the distance, patient and methodical, waiting for the shot. Below him, an American anti-aircraft battery saw aircraft diving toward them at high speed. They could not identify them. The altitude was too low, the speed too high, the angle too steep. They saw shapes and movement and assumed enemy. They opened fire. 50 caliber machine guns and 37mm automatic cannons filled the air with tracer rounds and exploding shells. George Preddy, the deadliest Mustang pilot in the war, flew directly into the stream of fire. Multiple rounds struck his aircraft. The engine seized. The controls went dead. The Mustang nosed over and hit the ground near the village of St. Vith at full speed. There was no time to bail out. There was no time for anything. He died instantly. The anti-aircraft crew realized their mistake within seconds. The wreckage was American. The markings were Allied. They had just killed one of their own. The reports went up the chain of command, and the official record recorded the death of Major George Preddy Jr., killed in action by friendly fire on December 25, 1944. He was 25 years old. 4 months later, in April 1945, his younger brother, Second Lieutenant William Preddy, also a Mustang pilot, was killed by German ground fire during a strafing run over Czechoslovakia. The two brothers, who had both chosen the sky, who had both flown Mustangs, who had both killed for their country, were buried side by side in the American cemetery at St. Avold, France. Their headstones stand together, 2 names among thousands, markers for men who gave everything and received, in the end, only silence. George Preddy's record of 26.83 aerial victories remains the highest total ever achieved by a pilot flying the North American P-51 Mustang. No one has broken it. No one ever will. The aircraft he flew, the tactics he mastered, and the war he fought are all gone now, preserved only in records and photographs, and the fading memories of men who are no longer alive to tell the story. What remains is the fact of his skill, the tragedy of his death, and the cold arithmetic of air combat in a war that consumed 50 million lives. He was not a hero in the way that Hollywood imagines heroes. He did not die saving anyone. He did not make a final speech or go down fighting against impossible odds. He died because war is chaos, because friendly fire is a statistical inevitability, and because even the best pilot in the world is just meat and bone inside a machine that can be destroyed in an instant. His death meant nothing except that he was gone, and the war continued without him, and the sky over Europe remained full of violence until the Germans finally surrendered 5 months later. But his skill mattered. His discipline mattered. His refusal to quit after the Navy rejected him, after the mid-air collision nearly killed him, after hundreds of missions that should have ground him down into nothing, that refusal mattered. He proved that mastery was possible, that excellence could be achieved even in the worst circumstances, and that some men could look at the machinery of industrial warfare and bend it to their will through sheer competence and relentless focus. He was the best Mustang pilot who ever lived, and he died on Christmas Day under American guns, and both of those facts are true, and neither one cancels the other out. The war ended, the survivors went home, the dead stayed in the ground. George Preddy stayed in France, next to his brother, 2 more names in a cemetery full of men who died before they grew old. The Mustangs were scrapped or sold or put in museums. The tactics were studied and refined, and taught to new generations of pilots who would fight new wars in new aircraft. The records were preserved in official histories and unit citations and gun camera footage that flickered in black and white, silent evidence of moments that were anything but silent when they happened. And the story, which began with a boy who wanted to fly and was told he could not, which continued through rejection and persistence and survival and mastery, which reached its peak on a single afternoon in August when he killed 6 men in 6 separate engagements and came home alive, which ended on a frozen Christmas morning when friendly fire tore him out of the sky. That story remains. It is a story about what human beings can do when they are trained and equipped and placed in situations where only the best survive. It is a story about the cost of excellence. It is a story about how wars are fought by individuals who have names and families and futures, and how those futures are erased in seconds by decisions made by other individuals who also have names and families, and who will carry the weight of those decisions until they die. George Preddy was the deadliest North American P-51 Mustang pilot in the history of the Second World War. He scored 26.83 confirmed aerial victories. He survived the Pacific, a mid-air collision, hundreds of combat missions, and the most intense air war ever fought. And then, on December 25, 1944, he was killed by his own side while chasing an enemy fighter over Belgium. His younger brother died 4 months later. They are buried together in France. The record he set has never been broken. That is the story. That is what happened. That is all there is. If this story affected you, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into the real history of the Second World War. Leave a comment below and tell us which moment from George Preddy's life hit you the hardest. Was it the rejections from the Navy, the mid-air collision, the 6 kills in one day, or the tragedy of his death on Christmas morning? And let us know where you are watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments. We read every single one. Thank you for watching, and remember that behind every statistic, every record, and every number. There was a human being who lived and died in ways that deserve to be remembered.